During the wedding, my heart should have been light. Everyone was laughing, clinking glasses, and celebrating the union of my daughter with a man I had hoped would cherish her. But my gut had been uneasy for weeks. Something about her fiancé, his family, the way they whispered in corners and shot sideways glances, it felt wrong. I told myself I was just being protective, imagining shadows where there were none. And yet, when she leaned over during the ceremony and quietly slipped a folded note into my pocket that read, "Dade, help me," the world stopped. I didn't show it, I couldn't. Smiling through the ceremony, clapping when they kissed, shaking hands with the in-laws, I carried that tiny folded paper like a hidden flame burning inside me. Later, in the privacy of my hotel room, I unfolded it. The handwriting was small, tight, trembling. My daughter had always been careful, precise, cautious, and yet this message was urgent, desperate, and terrified. I read it again and again, each time imagining the horror behind her words. 3 months passed. Every day felt like a war I wasn't allowed to fight openly. I watched her from a distance, checking social media, speaking to old friends she trusted, hiring discreet investigators. Piece by piece, I unraveled the nightmare she had been living under. Her perfect husband and his family were predators in disguise. Financial scams, emotional manipulation, and subtle threats had isolated her from everyone who could have protected her. She had been trapped, pretending to smile while begging for escape. And then, one day, the opportunity arrived. Her husband had grown careless, flaunting his arrogance, making threats in front of witnesses, and treating people with the same cruelty he had inflicted on my daughter. I had spent weeks setting the stage, quietly securing evidence, recording conversations, and preparing the legal and financial arsenal that would crush him. When the moment came, I acted swiftly. The same people who had laughed at me at the wedding, thinking they were untouchable, suddenly found themselves cornered, their lies unraveled, their power stripped away, their reputation shattered. The day I walked into that office, files in hand, I saw the fear in their eyes, the same kind of fear my daughter had felt, whispered into that note months ago. And finally, she was free. My daughter, pale and exhausted, ran into my arms, tears flowing, whispering over and over, "Thank you, Dad. You saved me." It wasn't just revenge, it was justice. 3 months of planning, watching, waiting, and striking had restored her life. They had believed that cunning and cruelty would win, that a father could do nothing from the sidelines. They were wrong. And in that quiet, triumphant moment, I realized that sometimes the fiercest love is silent until it has to roar. For 3 long months, I lived a double life, and no one around me suspected a thing. On the surface, I was just an aging father trying to adjust to the fact that his daughter was married now, posting polite comments online, asking casual questions on the phone, laughing when expected to laugh. But beneath that calm exterior, every breath I took was fueled by one purpose: getting my daughter out alive and whole. The note she had slipped into my pocket during her wedding replayed in my mind every single night. "Dad, help me." 2 words that refused to let me sleep, eat, or rest. I knew I couldn't rush in blindly. If I did, I might make things worse. Whatever trap she was in had been carefully built, and tearing it apart required patience, precision, and silence. I started by listening more than I spoke. When my daughter called, I never pushed. I let her talk about small things, the weather, her home, what she cooked for dinner, while I focused on the pauses in her voice, the moments when her tone shifted, or when she suddenly grew cautious. I learned which questions made her nervous, and which ones made her feel safe. I realized she was never alone when she spoke to me. Someone was always nearby, always listening. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Next, I began reaching out to people from her past without ever mentioning her directly. Old friends, former coworkers, even a neighbor from her college days. I asked harmless questions, framed as curiosity or nostalgia, and slowly patterns began to emerge. She had cut off nearly everyone she loved. Not abruptly, but gradually, the way a spider tightens a web, one strand at a time. Invitations declined, messages unanswered, visits postponed indefinitely. Isolation, I learned, wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. I hired help, quietly. Not the flashy kind that asks questions and leaves footprints, but professionals who understood discretion. Background checks turned into financial reviews. Financial reviews turned into legal red flags. What looked like a respectable family from the outside was hiding layers of deceit underneath. Shell companies. Lawsuits settled quietly. Former business partners who had vanished after disagreements. None of it was illegal enough on its own to bring them down, but together, it painted a picture of people who survived by intimidating others into silence. Every discovery made my blood boil, but I forced myself to slow down. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about control, taking it back from people who had stolen it from my child. I documented everything: dates, times, names. I stored copies in multiple places, encrypted and protected. If anything happened to me, the truth would still come out. There were nights when doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if I was overreacting? What if confronting them destroyed her life instead of saving it? But then I would remember the way her hand trembled as she passed me that note, hidden beneath lace and flowers. No fear looks like that unless it's real. I tested their arrogance carefully. Small provocations, casual remarks about finances, innocent questions about their future plans. Each time, they revealed more than they intended. People who believe they're powerful grow careless. They talk too much. They threaten without realizing they're being heard. They assume no one is watching. I made sure they were wrong. At the same time, I prepared my daughter for freedom without ever saying the word. I reminded her of who she was before them, what she loved, what she was good at, the strength she used to carry so naturally. I spoke about her childhood, her resilience, her kindness, planting seeds of courage she could hold on to when things felt unbearable. I wanted her ready, because when the moment came, there would be no time for hesitation. By the end of those 3 months, I had everything I needed. Evidence stacked neatly like dominoes, waiting for a single push. Legal strategies mapped out, safe places arranged, support systems reactivated. What they thought was a powerless, aging father had quietly become their worst mistake. And when I finally looked at the calendar and realized how much time had passed, I understood something deeply unsettling and profoundly empowering. Patience, when fueled by love, is far more dangerous than anger. They had spent 3 months believing they had won. I had spent 3 months making sure they never would again. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like water through cracks I hadn't known existed, soaking everything I believed about my daughter's new life. At first, I told myself she was just adjusting. Marriage was a change, after all. New routines, new expectations, new people. When she missed my calls or kept our conversations painfully short, I convinced myself she was busy or tired. But the silence had weight. It pressed against my chest in a way that wouldn't let me breathe easy. One evening, I finally noticed how carefully she chose her words. She spoke as if each sentence had to be approved by someone standing just out of earshot. There were pauses where laughter should have been, moments where her voice dropped suddenly, like she'd remembered something she wasn't allowed to say. When I asked how she was really doing, she answered too quickly, too cheerfully. That's when I knew. My daughter wasn't just unhappy, she was afraid. I began paying attention to the details most people overlook. The way she never talked about money, even casually. The way she avoided mentioning her husband's parents at all, as if pretending they didn't exist might make them disappear. When I suggested visiting, she hesitated before agreeing, then called back an hour later to cancel with a weak excuse. That hesitation haunted me. No one should need permission to see their own father. Quietly, I reached out to an old friend of hers, someone she had been inseparable from before the wedding. The friend hesitated too, then admitted they hadn't spoken in months. Not because of a fight, but because my daughter had slowly stopped responding. Another friend told me the same story. So did a former coworker. One by one, the connections that had once surrounded my daughter had been severed, neatly and methodically. Isolation wasn't a side effect of her marriage. It was the foundation of it. That's when I decided to stop guessing and start proving. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't warn my daughter of what I was doing. I knew that if the people controlling her sensed even a hint of resistance, they would tighten their grip. Instead, I moved like a shadow, asking questions that sounded harmless, listening more than I spoke. I learned how to look concerned without appearing suspicious, curious without appearing threatening. The deeper I dug, the uglier things became. Financial records revealed that accounts had been opened in my daughter's name, without her full understanding. Assets quietly shifted. Debts that weren't hers on paper suddenly were. I discovered that her husband had a history of failed ventures that always seemed to leave someone else holding the blame. Former partners who had lost everything while he walked away clean. Complaints that never reached court because the complainants had been intimidated into silence. What chilled me most wasn't the money. It was the pattern. Control disguised as care. Dependence masked as love. Every move designed to make my daughter feel smaller, weaker, incapable of surviving without them. They had convinced her that the world outside their home was hostile, dangerous, and unforgiving. That she was lucky to be protected. That without them, she would fail. I replayed our past conversations in my mind, and finally understood why she always defended them, even when her voice shook doing it. She wasn't protecting them. She was protecting herself. When fear becomes routine, it starts to feel like normal life. There were nights I wanted to drive to her house and demand answers, to pull her out by force if I had to. But I held back. Acting on impulse would only confirm what they had taught her, that I was reckless, emotional, unsafe. I had to be the opposite of everything they claimed I was. I had to be steady, predictable, unshakable. I documented everything with obsessive care. Screenshots of messages, copies of financial statements, notes from conversations that revealed contradictions. I spoke to professionals who understood how these situations worked, people who had seen control disguised as marriage before. Each confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just a bad relationship, it was a cage. Meanwhile, I watched my daughter fade. Her photos lost their color. Her smile no longer reached her eyes. She stopped talking about the future altogether, as if imagining it had become too painful. Every time we spoke, I fought the urge to ask if she wanted me to come get her. Because I knew that if she said no, not because she didn't want to leave, but because she didn't believe she could, I would break. The turning point came unexpectedly, a careless mistake on their part, a threat made too openly, words spoken in confidence to someone they underestimated. That single moment confirmed everything I had suspected and gave me the proof I needed. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because doubt was gone. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. My daughter was trapped, and now I could prove it. I looked at the calendar and realized how much time had passed since the wedding. Since the note. Since the moment my daughter had asked for help in the only way she safely could. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, heavy and absolute. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt clarity. They believed they had erased her past, rewritten her future, and neutralized the one person who would never stop fighting for her. They were wrong. They had underestimated something powerful and patient. A father who had finally seen the truth, and who would not rest until his daughter had her life back. For 3 months, I became invisible by design. Not absent, just unremarkable. I answered calls when expected, sent polite messages on birthdays and holidays, and showed no sign that anything was wrong. To them, I was exactly what they believed me to be, an aging father who had accepted his place on the sidelines of his daughter's new life. That illusion was my greatest weapon. While they dismissed me, I planned everything. Every day began the same way. I woke up early, before the noise of the world could distract me, and reviewed what I already knew. I organized facts the way a surgeon lays out instruments, clean, precise, ready. I tracked timelines, inconsistencies, financial shifts, behavioral changes. I didn't rush. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes get people hurt, especially people who are already trapped. I learned to control my emotions with brutal discipline. Anger flared often, especially late at night when exhaustion stripped away my defenses. I would imagine my daughter sitting alone in a room she didn't feel safe in, rehearsing smiles she had to wear the next day. On those nights, I clenched my fists until my hands ached, then forced myself to breathe. Rage would only cloud my judgment. Love had to be colder than fear if it was going to win. I tested my assumptions carefully. Whenever I gathered a piece of information, I looked for 2 more sources to confirm it. If something felt too easy, I treated it as a trap. I wasn't dealing with amateurs. People who build cages know how to hide the bars. They rely on confusion, on self-doubt, on making their victims question their own instincts. I refused to fall into that same fog. I created layers of protection without alerting anyone. Copies of evidence were stored in different locations. Digital files were encrypted. Paper trails were duplicated. If I was confronted, if I was threatened, if something happened to me, the truth wouldn't disappear with me. That knowledge steadied me more than anything else. It reminded me that this wasn't just about rescuing my daughter, it was about making sure no one could ever silence her again. Occasionally, I allowed myself to be underestimated on purpose. I asked naive questions. I played the role of the confused father who didn't understand modern finances or complicated legal matters. I nodded while they explained things slowly, smugly, convinced they were educating someone beneath them. Every explanation gave me insight into how they thought, how they justified what they were doing, and how confident they felt that no one could stop them. People like that always reveal themselves eventually. Arrogance makes them sloppy. They begin to believe their own lies. They stop checking who's listening. I noticed it in the way they spoke to service workers, to distant relatives, to anyone they thought had no power. Small cruelties. Casual threats disguised as jokes. Each moment was another thread I added to the net I was weaving. I kept my daughter out of it as much as possible. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me wanted to warn her, to tell her help was coming, to give her something to hold on to. But I knew that hope, if discovered, could become another weapon against her. So instead, I focused on strengthening her quietly. I spoke to her the way I always had, reminding her of her intelligence, her courage, her ability to solve problems. I told stories about times she had overcome fear in the past, not to hint at escape, but to remind her of who she was before fear became her constant companion. Sometimes she responded with silence. Sometimes with a weak laugh. Sometimes with tears she tried to hide. Each reaction told me where she was emotionally, how much pressure she was under. I adjusted accordingly. I learned when to push gently and when to step back. Planning wasn't just about strategy, it was about timing. There were moments when everything nearly collapsed. A surprise visit announced at the last minute. A question asked too sharply. A look of suspicion that lingered a second longer than it should have. Each time, I adapted, smoothed things over, retreated just enough to restore the illusion. I reminded myself that survival wasn't cowardice, it was preparation. As the weeks passed, I felt myself changing. I was calmer, more focused, less reactive. Fear had sharpened me instead of weakening me. I understood then why patience is so dangerous in the hands of someone who knows exactly what they're waiting for. While they lived day to day, certain of their control, I lived 3 steps ahead, already preparing for consequences they hadn't imagined. By the end of the 3rd month, I no longer questioned whether I was ready. I knew every angle of the situation, every weakness in their story, every lever that could be pulled. I had built alliances they didn't know existed, secured protections they couldn't undo, and mapped out outcomes that ensured my daughter would never have to face them alone again. What surprised me most wasn't how strong my plan had become. It was how quiet my mind felt. The chaos that had consumed me after the wedding was gone, replaced by clarity and resolve. I understood then that this phase, the waiting, the watching, the planning, was not a delay. It was the battle itself. They thought nothing was happening because nothing was visible. They mistook silence for surrender. And in doing so, they gave me the greatest advantage of all time. Arrogance has a smell to it, subtle but unmistakable, once you know it well. It's the scent of people who believe they are untouchable, who have gotten away with too much for too long. I began to notice it everywhere around them. In the way they spoke louder than necessary in public places, confident no one would challenge them. In the way they mocked others behind closed doors, laughing at suffering as if it were proof of intelligence. They had grown comfortable, and comfort makes predators careless. It started with small slips. A comment made too openly at a family gathering, where my daughter's husband complained about how people who don't understand money shouldn't be allowed to make decisions. He didn't realize how closely I was watching his face, how his eyes flicked briefly toward my daughter, daring her to disagree. She stayed silent, head slightly lowered. He mistook that silence for loyalty. It was submission born of exhaustion, and it fueled his confidence. They began to underestimate everyone, not just me. They spoke freely around people they believed were beneath them, assistants, acquaintances, distant relatives. And those people listened. Some out of fear, some out of resentment, some simply because they were tired of being treated like furniture. I made myself available to them without pushing, without demanding. I listened. People are far more willing to talk when they don't feel interrogated. One evening, A careless boast revealed more than months of quiet investigation had. He laughed about how contracts were just paper, and how pressure makes people reasonable. The room went quiet for a moment, but he didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his own cleverness. I felt something settle into place inside me then. This wasn't just cruelty. This was a pattern of intimidation disguised as intelligence, and patterns can be proven. Their confidence grew bolder with time. They began making threats less subtly, convinced that fear had done its job. They forgot that fear has limits, that eventually it stops working and starts being recorded, remembered, repeated. They forgot that walls don't just trap people inside, they amplify sound. Words they thought were private traveled farther than they imagined. I let them believe their narrative. That my daughter had chosen this life willingly. That I was old, fashioned, out of touch, harmless. I nodded when they spoke, asked questions that made them feel important, even impressed. Each time they explained themselves, they revealed more of how they justified what they did. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as winners, and winners, in their minds, don't need to be careful. What finally broke the illusion completely was a single act of cruelty they didn't bother to hide. A threat delivered casually, with witnesses present, masked as a joke, but sharp enough to draw blood. My daughter's face drained of color, and for just a second, her mask slipped. They didn't notice. They were too busy enjoying the power of the moment. That was when I knew they had crossed from secrecy into arrogance, from control into recklessness. I watched how quickly they dismissed concerns afterward, how easily they brushed off the discomfort they had caused. They truly believed no one would act. That belief was their downfall. Power built on intimidation depends on the assumption that everyone else is too afraid, too weak, too isolated to respond. The moment that assumption is wrong, everything collapses. I began connecting the dots they had carelessly left behind. Statements that contradicted official records. Stories that shifted depending on the audience. Timelines that didn't add up. Each inconsistency was small on its own, but together they formed a picture too clear to ignore. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. The truth was already louder than any accusation. They continued living as if nothing could touch them. Planning lavish events. Making future promises. Spending money as if consequences were a myth invented for other people. Watching them felt surreal, like observing someone dancing on a frozen lake, unaware of how thin the ice had become. Meanwhile, my daughter grew quieter. Not weaker, just quieter. There's a difference. Her silence was no longer just fear, it was endurance. She was surviving each day the only way she could, conserving energy for a moment she couldn't yet see. I made sure she wasn't alone in that endurance, even if she didn't know the full extent of what was coming. I made sure she felt seen. There was a strange calm that settled over me as their mistakes multiplied, not satisfaction, not joy, just certainty. I understood then that they had already lost, even if they hadn't realized it yet. They were still playing a game of intimidation, while I was preparing the consequences of truth. They had grown careless because they believed fear was permanent. They believed silence meant obedience. They believed time worked in their favor. They were wrong on every count. Fear fades, silence can be strategic, and time, when used wisely, sharpens the blade instead of dulling it. By the time they sensed something shifting, it was already too late. Their arrogance had given me exactly what I needed: proof, witnesses, and a clear path forward. They had mistaken cruelty for strength and control for intelligence. And in doing so, they had exposed themselves completely. All they could see was the present moment, secure and comfortable. I could see what came next. The moment I decided to act, everything moved faster than I expected. Not because I rushed, but because the groundwork had already been laid. What looked sudden to them was simply the final step of a plan that had been quietly breathing for months. I chose the timing carefully, waiting for a day when their confidence was at its peak, and their guard at its lowest. People are most vulnerable when they believe they are winning. I didn't announce myself. I didn't threaten or warn. I let the system do what it was designed to do once it was finally given the truth. Documents were submitted in the right order, to the right offices, through people who knew how to ask the right questions. Conversations that had once been brushed off as misunderstandings were now supported by evidence. Financial records spoke louder than denials ever could. Statements contradicted each other, timelines collapsed, and explanations that once sounded clever now sounded desperate. The first reaction was disbelief. I saw it on their faces when the pressure began to mount. Confusion first, then irritation. They assumed this was a mistake, something that could be corrected with a phone call or a display of authority. When that didn't work, irritation turned into anger. Voices rose. Accusations flew. They blamed assistants, blamed outsiders, blamed each other. Still, none of them blamed me. I was supposed to be irrelevant. That illusion shattered quickly. When they realized where the evidence had come from, the fear was immediate and raw. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, tight fear that shows up in clenched jaws and shaking hands. They tried to regain control the only way they knew how, through intimidation. Calls went unanswered. Messages went from polite to aggressive to pleading. I said nothing. Silence, at this stage, was more powerful than any response. The reputation they had built so carefully began to crack. People who had once defended them suddenly distanced themselves. Partnerships were paused. Invitations disappeared. The same charm that had once protected them now sounded hollow. Once doubt enters a room, it spreads faster than truth ever could on its own. They had taught me that lesson themselves. The hardest part was watching my daughter during all of this. I couldn't tell her everything, not yet. I only told her enough to keep her safe, enough to prepare her for what was coming. When she realized the balance of power was shifting, I saw something return to her eyes that I hadn't seen in months. Hope. It was fragile, cautious, but real. She didn't celebrate. She waited. Survivors always do. When the confrontation finally happened, it wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it seem. There was no shouting, no public spectacle. Just facts laid out one by one, impossible to deny. The people who had once spoken over everyone else now struggled to be heard. They tried to bargain, to minimize, to reframe the narrative. None of it worked. Truth has a weight to it that excuses can't lift. My daughter sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge in the way they understood it. This was about accountability. About restoring what had been taken piece by piece. Every time they tried to shift blame onto her, the evidence pushed back harder. For the first time since the wedding, she wasn't being spoken for. She was being protected. When it was over, the room felt different. Lighter, not because justice had been perfectly served, but because the lie was finally dead. They had lost their power the moment the truth became public. Everything after that was just paperwork. The aftermath wasn't clean or easy. Freedom never is. My daughter had to rebuild parts of herself that had been worn down slowly and deliberately. There were moments of grief for the life she thought she was getting, moments of anger for the time that had been stolen from her. I stayed close, not as a rescuer, but as a steady presence. She didn't need someone to fight for her anymore. She needed space to breathe. They tried one last time to reach out, to appeal to sympathy, to rewrite history. I didn't respond. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed. One evening, weeks later, my daughter looked at me and said something I will carry with me forever. She said, "I didn't think anyone could help me without making things worse." Her voice didn't shake when she said it. That was how I knew she was healing. What they had built with fear collapsed under the weight of truth. What I built with patience stood firm. They begged because they had lost control. I stayed silent because I never needed it. And in that silence, my daughter finally found her voice again. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks or celebration. It came quietly, almost hesitantly, as if it wasn't sure it was welcome yet. The day my daughter walked out of that life for the last time, she carried only a small bag. No dramatic goodbye, no final words. Just a pause at the doorway, a long breath, and then a step forward she hadn't believed she was strong enough to take. I stood a few feet away, not reaching for her, not guiding her, just there. She needed to know that this step was hers. At first, she didn't know what to do with the silence. Real silence, not the tense quiet that comes from walking on eggshells, but the kind that doesn't demand anything. She slept with the lights on. She startled at sudden noises. Sometimes she apologized for things that didn't require apology at all. I saw how deeply the fear had rooted itself, how it lingered even after the danger was gone. Freedom, I learned, is not the absence of chains. It's the slow unlearning of them. We didn't rush healing. There was no timeline, no checklist, no expectation that she should be better. Now that it was over, Some days she talked endlessly, as if making up for months of swallowed words. Other days she barely spoke at all, retreating into herself, processing emotions that had been postponed for survival. I let her lead. Control had been taken from her for too long. I wasn't going to take it back in the name of care. There were moments when guilt surfaced, sharp and unexpected. She blamed herself for not leaving sooner, for not speaking louder, for believing promises that had been lies. Each time, I reminded her gently that survival is not weakness, and fear is not consent. That she had done what she needed to do to stay alive in a situation designed to make her feel powerless. Slowly, those reminders began to sink in. Rebuilding her sense of self took time. We started with small things. Choosing what to eat without worrying about judgment. Going for walks without asking permission. Reconnecting with friends she thought she had lost forever. Some relationships picked up where they had left off. Others didn't. That hurt, but it was honest. Healing isn't about restoring the past exactly as it was. It's about creating something new that doesn't require pretending. There were setbacks. Nights when memories returned uninvited. Days when confidence crumbled without warning. Trauma doesn't leave politely, it tests the door repeatedly. When that happened, I didn't rush to fix it. I sat with her. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Presence, I learned, was more important than advice. As weeks turned into months, I saw changes that felt almost miraculous in their subtlety. She laughed more freely. Her shoulders relaxed. She began making plans again, tentative at first, then bolder. She spoke about the future not as something to endure, but something to shape. The light in her eyes didn't return all at once. It flickered, strengthened, and finally stayed. One evening, we sat together watching the sun disappear behind the horizon. She said, quietly, "I forgot who I was back then." There was no bitterness in her voice, only reflection. She wasn't mourning that version of herself anymore. She was understanding her, honoring the strength it took to survive long enough to escape. As for me, I carried my own quiet reckoning. The rage that had fueled me for months had nowhere to go now. It dissolved, leaving behind something steadier and deeper. Gratitude, not relief, gratitude, for timing, for patience, for the fact that she had trusted me with that note. With those two words that changed everything. Dad, help me. I will never forget the weight of them. Or the responsibility they placed on my heart. They tried once more to reach out, long after the consequences had settled in. An apology that wasn't really an apology. A request disguised as regret. I didn't respond. Closure, I realized, doesn't always require a final conversation. Sometimes it's knowing that you no longer need one. My daughter eventually moved into a place of her own. The day she unpacked the last box, she stood in the middle of the room and smiled, not the careful smile she once wore, but a genuine one, unguarded and calm. She said, "This feels like mine," and it was, her space, her life, her choice. What they took from her could never be fully returned. Time doesn't rewind. But what they failed to destroy was far more important. Her spirit. Her capacity to trust herself again. Her ability to ask for help when she needed it. Revenge was never about making them suffer. It was about making sure she could live without fear. Justice wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, firm, and lasting. And every time I see her now, standing taller, speaking freely, living honestly, I know something with absolute certainty. The moment she slipped that note into my pocket, she wasn't asking me to save her. She was asking me to walk beside her until she could save herself. That, in the end, was the most powerful outcome of all.